The mud sucked at Otto's boots as he stood alone on that March morning in 1941, watching the half-finished runways stretch out toward Narragansett Bay. Quonset Point Naval Air Station sprawled behind him in Rhode Island, still very much under construction. The wind cut across the frozen ground with an edge that made him pull his coat tighter. When Admiral Ben Morial appeared beside him, Otto knew immediately this wasn't a routine inspection. The envelope in the Admiral's hand bore Navy Department stamps, sealed with the weight of official business. Morial didn't make social calls to construction sites. Otto wiped the mud from his hands. At 38 years old, he was the only licensed architect working for George A. Fuller Company, and he'd spent the last 6 months watching this naval expansion project move forward piece by piece. It had all been routine: federal contracts, paperwork, the ordinary work of building military facilities, nothing that suggested his life was about to change entirely. "Read it now," Morial said, handing him the envelope, not a request, an order. The pages inside were military issue, typed on official letterhead, single-spaced, each word chosen with brutal precision. What Otto read made his hands begin to tremble slightly. The assignment was straightforward enough on the surface. Design a portable military shelter, strong enough to withstand combat conditions, light enough to transport anywhere in the world. Simple enough that 10 men with no construction training could assemble it in a single day using only basic hand tools. But then came the line that changed everything: deliver the first production units in 60 days. "Sir," Otto said, his voice steady though his hands weren't, "this says June 1st. That's 8 weeks." "I can count," Morial replied flatly. His eyes held no sympathy, only expectation. Otto had served in the military before. He knew what happened when engineering got rushed. Buildings collapsed, bridges failed, men died because someone prioritized speed over safety. "Admiral, with respect, proper testing alone requires—" "We don't have time for proper testing." Morial's voice cut off the objection. "War is coming. When it does, we'll need to build advanced bases across the Pacific faster than the Japanese can move. We need shelters that ordinary sailors can construct under fire, using equipment they can carry. The British have been using Nissan huts since the last war, but they're inadequate. You're going to design something better." He pulled a second envelope from his coat. "British specifications. Study them, improve them, then build me 8,200 units for immediate deployment." 8,200. Otto stared at the number, trying to process what it meant. "Your country is depending on you, Mr. Brandenberger," Morial said, already turning to leave. His boots squelched through the mud as he walked away. "Don't let us down." Otto stood alone in the March wind, 2 envelopes now in his hands that suddenly felt like they weighed far more than paper and ink. Around him, construction crews hammered and welded and poured concrete for runways that would soon launch patrol aircraft into the Atlantic. Regular work, predictable work. Nothing about the next 60 days would follow any predictable pattern. That afternoon, back at Fuller's temporary office, a converted warehouse 3 miles inland, Otto spread the British specifications across the drafting table. His partner Peter de Jong leaned over his shoulder, studying the drawings in silence. Peter was 53, a career engineer who'd spent 30 years building bridges, factories, military installations. He had the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced impossible problems and somehow found ways through them. "So many times they stop seeming impossible," Peter said, almost to himself. The Nissan hut blueprints showed something elegant in its simplicity, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel, like a metal pipe cut lengthwise and laid on the ground. The design dated back to World War I, created by a Canadian engineer named Peter Norman Nissan. British troops had used thousands of them along the Western Front. "It's well thought out," Peter acknowledged. "A continuous arch distributes the load evenly, no complex framing. Just curved steel panels bolted to a simple rib structure." But Otto was already sketching modifications, his pencil moving quickly across the margins. "Look at the footprint, though. The arch meets the ground, which means you lose half the interior space. A 6-foot soldier has to duck when he's more than 4 feet from the center. And there's no floor, just dirt. No insulation either. The British version is just 2 layers of corrugated steel with an air gap. It's essentially a steel tent. Peter studied the drawings for another minute, then straightened up. "We can fix this." Otto wanted to believe him, but his hands were still shaking. Over the next 72 hours, they dismantled the Nissan concept and rebuilt it from scratch. They added a raised plywood floor, 1-inch tongue and groove planks that would keep soldiers off frozen ground or tropical mud. They layered in masonite interior walls with paper insulation sandwiched between the steel shells. They redesigned the T-shaped steel ribs to carry more weight and bolt directly to the floor framework. They made the entire structure modular, packable into 12 wooden crates that fit standard cargo holds. Otto's architectural background gave him the ability to visualize what the interior would actually feel like to the men living inside. Peter's engineering expertise transformed those visions into load calculations, material specifications, assembly sequences. They worked 18-hour shifts, sustained by coffee and the terror of missing Moriel's deadline. By March 23rd, 3 days after receiving the orders, Otto delivered preliminary drawings to the Navy Bureau in Washington. The officer who reviewed them was Lieutenant Commander Harrison, a career logistics man who'd spent 2 decades moving supplies across continents and oceans. He studied the plans for 20 minutes without speaking. "This is heavier than the Nissan," he finally said. "By about 400 pounds per unit," Otto admitted. "But it's insulated, it has a real floor, and we estimate it'll be 30% warmer in Arctic conditions." "How fast can you build them?" "We don't know yet. We haven't built one." Harrison's eyes sharpened. "You're asking me to approve a design you've never tested. We're asking you to let us deliver 8,200 units in 57 days. Sir, we don't have time to build prototypes, test them, then manufacture. We have to do everything simultaneously." The silence stretched out between them as Harrison calculated risk, weighed unknowns, considered what might happen if he was wrong. "Provisional approval," he finally said. "Start manufacturing. But if your first unit fails assembly testing, we cancel the entire contract." Otto's throat went dry. Understood. Fuller's management made the boldest decision of the entire project. They began constructing the manufacturing plant before the design was finalized. At West Davisville, Rhode Island, crews worked around the clock, erecting a sprawling factory complex in just 30 days. It violated every principle of rational business planning. If the design failed, Fuller would own a massive empty factory with no purpose. But if it succeeded, they'd have the production capacity to meet Moriel's deadline. Meanwhile, Otto and Peter faced their most significant technical obstacle. How do you bend corrugated steel sheets into a perfect 8-foot radius curve? Flat corrugated panels possessed strength because the ridges provided structural rigidity. But bending them meant forcing those ridges to compress on the inside of the curve and stretch on the outside. Push too hard, and the metal would split along every corrugation line. They brought the problem to Anderson Sheet Metal Company in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the few fabricators in New England with equipment capable of handling large-scale bending operations. Anderson's chief engineer was a man named Sullivan, 60 years old, who'd been shaping metal since before Otto was born. He examined their specifications, ran calculations, then shook his head. "Can't be done, not reliably, not at the scale you're talking about." "We need 8,000 units," Peter said. "That's 160,000 curved panels." "Then you need a different design," Sullivan replied. "Flat panels, angled sections. Something that doesn't require bending corrugated stock." Something cold settled in Otto's chest. They were in week 5 of 8. The factory at West Davisville was nearly complete. The Navy had already ordered 8,200 units for immediate deployment to Britain under Lend-Lease. Admiral Moriel expected the first huts shipped by June. Every day of delay meant more American troops sleeping in canvas tents when the war arrived. And Otto knew war was coming. Everyone knew. The question wasn't if, but when. He stared at the corrugated steel sample on Sullivan's desk, running his fingers along the ridges. Somewhere in this metal was the answer. It had to be, because failure simply wasn't possible. Not when millions of lives would eventually depend on what he built in the next 3 weeks. It was Sullivan's shop foreman who saved the entire project. His name was Jonas Petroskas, a Lithuanian immigrant in his mid-40s who'd worked sheet metal for 2 decades. While Sullivan insisted the bending operation was impossible, Jonas stood quietly in the corner of the fabrication floor, running his calloused fingers along a corrugated steel sample, listening to the sound it made when he flexed it slightly. "Maybe not impossible," Jonas said in accented English, "just impossible the way we've been thinking about it." Sullivan turned. "You have an idea?" "Cold bending tears the metal because we're forcing it all at once," Jonas explained. "But what if we don't force it? What if we let the metal tell us how it wants to bend?" Otto leaned forward. "I'm listening." Jonas disappeared into the back of the shop and returned with wooden blocks, clamps, and a soldering torch. "We build a jig, not a press. A jig with graduated pressure points. We heat the seam slightly, just enough to make the steel more forgiving. Then we roll the sheet slowly, incrementally, letting physics do the work instead of fighting it." He spent the next 6 hours building a prototype bending apparatus that looked more like a wooden cradle than industrial equipment. The corrugated panel sat in the jig while Jonas adjusted pressure points along its length, heating specific spots with the torch, then gradually tightening clamps to coax the metal into a curve rather than forcing it. Otto watched as the first panel emerged, a perfect 8-foot radius arc with no splits, no tears. The corrugations remained intact, still providing structural strength. He held it in his hands, feeling the ridges beneath his fingers. The metal was warm from the torch work. This might actually work. Peter was already calculating production rates. "How many jigs can you build? How many panels per shift?" Jonas smiled slightly. "Give me 2 weeks and I'll have 3 jigs running. We'll hit your numbers." But that night, sitting alone in the drafting room, Otto stared at the calendar on the wall. 23 days remained until June 1st. The factory at West Davisville was complete and waiting. Anderson's crew was fabricating panels. Steel corporations in Detroit were producing T-rib sections. Lumberyards were cutting plywood floor panels and masonite interior sheets. Everything was converging toward a deadline that allowed zero margin for error. But they still hadn't built a single complete hut. Only pieces. And Otto kept asking himself the same question. What if the pieces didn't fit together the way the drawings showed? What if the assembly sequence looked simple on paper, but proved impossible in practice? What if the instruction manual he'd written made perfect sense to him, but was gibberish to ordinary sailors who'd never built anything more complex than a bookshelf? The entire project rested on one fundamental assumption, that untrained men could assemble this shelter in 1 day using only hand tools. If that assumption proved wrong, 8,000 huts would arrive at advanced bases as useless piles of metal and wood. Otto needed proof, real proof, before the Navy committed to mass production. On May 15, 1941, the first prototype stood in an empty lot beside the West Davisville factory. 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, 8-foot radius arch. From the outside, it looked like a half-buried metal culvert. Not beautiful, not impressive, just functional. Otto brought in 10 Navy recruits for the assembly test. Not the legendary construction battalions, those wouldn't exist for another 10 months. Just ordinary sailors, ages ranging from 19 to 47. A farm boy from Iowa named Dale Hoffman. A mechanic from Detroit named Jimmy Torres. A grocer's son from Boston whose hands had never held anything heavier than a bag of flour. None of them had construction experience. That was the entire point. The test parameters were brutal in their simplicity. Assemble the Quonset hut using only the instruction manual and standard hand tools. 1 day of daylight. No supervisors, no engineers standing over their shoulders offering hints. Otto and Peter positioned themselves 50 yards away, forbidden from helping. Peter checked his watch every 5 minutes. Otto tried not to imagine Admiral Morial's reaction if this failed. At 800 hours, the sailors began unpacking the 12 wooden crates. Inside lay curved T-rib sections, corrugated panels, plywood end walls, masonite interior sheets, 1-inch floorboards, canvas bags filled with nuts and bolts and washers. Everything labeled, everything numbered, everything supposedly designed for foolproof assembly. The instruction manual contained 42 pages. Otto had written it himself, including detailed diagrams for every step. He'd tried to anticipate every possible mistake, every moment of confusion. Now he'd find out if he'd succeeded. By 9:30 hours, the sailors had laid the floor framework on the ground, a metal grid sitting on short stilts that elevated the hut 6 inches above the earth. This allowed drainage underneath and prevented rust. The tongue and groove plywood planks snapped together like a puzzle. First mistake. 2 sailors made a critical mistake, installing panels backward. It forced them to disassemble the pieces and begin again from scratch. 20 minutes evaporated in the process. When noon arrived, they paused for lunch, but only the floor was finished. The work had fallen behind schedule. Otto watched the men consume sandwiches and cigarettes, conversing quietly among themselves. Dale Hoffman, a farm boy from Iowa, used a stick to sketch patterns in the dirt, demonstrating to the crew how the T-ribs should connect with the floor framework. It was natural leadership taking shape. This was encouraging. The design wasn't completely overwhelming them after all. At 13:30 hours, work resumed. The T-ribs came next. Each one weighed 40 pounds. 2 men had to support one, while a third fastened it to the floor framework. 8 ribs total were positioned 4 feet apart, down the 36-foot length. In cross-section, they formed a T shape. The vertical portion of the T extended upward, the horizontal part attached to the floor. By 1500 hours, the steel skeleton reached completion. A cage of metal rose toward the sky, appearing impossibly delicate without its outer covering. Then came what Otto had been dreading most. The corrugated panels required exact overlaps at the sides. 2 corrugations precisely, 6 inches at the ends. Workers fastened them to the T-ribs through pre-drilled holes using hex bolts with washers on each side. They started at the bottom and worked upward toward the ridge, alternating left and right sides to preserve symmetry. Dale Hoffman discovered the pattern first. Align the panel, clamp it temporarily, drill through the marked holes, insert bolts, tighten, proceed to the next one. He taught the others, and they fell into synchronization, working in pairs, calling out when they needed additional hands. At 17:30 hours, with the sun descending and shadows stretching across the lot, they were fastening the final curved panel at the ridge when Dale's hand slipped. The bolt he'd been holding skittered across the curved roof, struck a T-rib, and clattered downward. Dale went rigid. He caught himself before cursing, glancing toward Otto and Peter standing 50 yards away. He searched his toolbox but found nothing. They'd used every fastener available. Peter moved forward automatically, but Otto gripped his arm with enough force to sting. "They'll solve it themselves or it's not foolproof," Otto said quietly. For 30 seconds nothing moved. Then Jimmy Torres, a mechanic from Detroit, recalled something from earlier. They'd installed one panel wrong that morning and removed it. The bolts from that mistake sat in a coffee can nearby. Jimmy retrieved it and passed one up to Dale. Dale secured the ridge panel. At 18:05 hours, 9 hours and 5 minutes since they started, the 10 sailors stepped back. Quonset hut number 001 stood complete. Otto walked through the interior slowly, running his hand across the masonite walls. Paper insulation showed between the outer corrugated shell and inner lining. He jumped on the floor, solid, no give. He checked the door seal, tight. He examined every bolt connection within reach. Then he circled the structure twice outside, searching for gaps, verifying panel overlap, testing overall soundness. The 10 sailors stood in a line, exhausted and covered in dirt and metal shavings, waiting for judgment. Otto faced them, and his voice came out strained, barely steady. "Gentlemen, you just built a Quonset hut." Dale Hoffman smiled. "Does that mean we passed, sir? It means Admiral Moriel is about to receive 8,200 of these. It means you 10 proved that ordinary Americans can accomplish extraordinary things when their nation requires it." Peter was already composing the telegram to Washington. The test was successful. Production could move forward at full scale. The Navy's bet on an untested design had succeeded. But Otto stood alone afterward, staring at the finished hut in the fading light. It wasn't striking to look at, just a curved metal shell with a floor and walls. But it functioned. 10 untrained men had put it together in one day using hand tools and a manual. Now they needed to build 8,000 more before everything changed. June 1941. The initial production units sailed to Britain under Lend-Lease, packed into 12-crate pallets that loaded perfectly into cargo ship holds. Then to Iceland for cold weather trials. Then to Caribbean advance bases where tropical humidity would determine if paper insulation could withstand moisture without decaying. By September, 8,200 T-rib Quonset huts had rolled off the West Davisville production line. Fuller Company had achieved Admiral Morial's seemingly impossible target. But the actual war hadn't started. These were preparations. Practice for a conflict everyone recognized was approaching, yet no one could foresee. Otto returned to ordinary tasks, federal contracts, building inspections. The intensity of the 60-day effort faded into distant memory. He sometimes wondered if the huts would ever experience genuine warfare, or if they'd simply remain in storage somewhere, gathering dust while politicians pursued peace that would never materialize. Then late October delivered a telegram that shifted everything. Otto was examining foundation plans for a warehouse project when his secretary knocked. "Mr. Brandon, this arrived from Navy Communications." The message was short, transmitted from Reykjavik harbor. "Quonset huts deployed Iceland. Stop. Initial reports excellent. Stop. Troops prefer to Nissen. Stop. Warmer, drier, faster to heat. Stop." Otto read it aloud to Peter and the engineering team. They marked the occasion with coffee and handshakes, the quiet satisfaction of professionals who'd solved a problem correctly. Yet the genuine trial remained ahead. Iceland sat at 64 degrees north latitude, a volcanic island in the North Atlantic where winter brought 18 hours of darkness and weather that could eliminate unprepared people in moments. The US Navy had established a base at Reykjavik in July 1941, anticipating the requirement to defend convoy passages from German submarines. British forces occupied the area already, living in Nissen huts they'd transported from England. For 2 months, the Quonsets weathered Icelandic autumn, freezing rain becoming sleet, winds averaging 40 knots, temperatures hovering near 0 Fahrenheit. Within the American shelters, troops remained warm. The 1-inch elevated floor kept them off frozen ground. Masonite walls with paper insulation held warmth far better than bare steel. Small coal stoves warmed the 576 square feet in under an hour. In the British Nissen huts, soldiers woke to ice on their blankets. The design that had served adequately on the Western Front in 1917 proved miserable at 64 degrees north, just 2 steel layers with an air gap between them. Elegant on paper, miserable in reality. The reports sent back to Washington told the story. American troops sleeping comfortably, British troops requesting assignment to American quarters. The Quonset design was demonstrating its superiority in precisely the environment it was intended for. Then, November 18th came. A low-pressure system developed 600 miles west of Iceland. Massive counterclockwise Arctic air colliding with warm Gulf Stream water. Meteorologists at Reykjavik monitored it throughout the afternoon as pressure dropped and wind speeds climbed. By 1800 hours, the base commander ordered all personnel inside shelter. By 2100 hours, winds had moved from 40 knots to 60, then 80. By midnight, the North Atlantic gale achieved hurricane force. Sustained winds of 95 knots, 109 miles per hour, gusts reaching 120 knots, 138 miles per hour. The kind of wind that turns rain sideways and makes breathing painful, that lifts objects and transforms them into weapons. In Reykjavik harbor, PBY Catalina flying boats broke loose from their moorings. These were massive machines, 63 feet long, with 104-foot wingspans, weighing 15 tons empty. The wind treated them like kindling. Sailors in bunkers watched the Catalinas lift, twist, and smash onto the beach. Aluminum skin tore away, frames bent into unrecognizable wreckage. 3 aircraft became total losses in under an hour. On the airfield, the British Nissen huts began failing. The design's fundamental weakness emerged in hurricane-force winds. The corrugated covering was fastened to an internal wooden frame with bolts spaced several feet apart. Under normal conditions, this worked. But at 138 miles per hour, wind found every seam, every space between the metal skin and wooden frame underneath. Pressure accumulated inside like air in a balloon. The first Nissan lost its covering at 100 hours. The corrugated steel simply ripped away from the frame, peeling back in sheets that tumbled across the airfield like enormous blades. British troops inside fled for the exit before the frame fell. The second hut lost its roof at 130. Wind tore through the opening, found the side panels and shredded them in moments. The third Nissan lost a bolt at 0200 hours. Just one bolt, sheared clean through by wind pressure and structural movement. But that single weak point spread instantly. The frame buckled. The entire structure pancaked into a twisted heap of corrugated steel and broken wood. British troops sheltered in a concrete bunker, watching through small windows as their quarters disintegrated. Some had occupied these huts for 4 months. Personal items, letters from home, photographs, everything inside was now scattered across the Icelandic tundra at 100 miles per hour. The American Quonsets stood 300 yards away. The design distinction appeared small on paper. Rather than corrugated panels fastened to a wooden frame, Quonset panels bolted directly to the steel T-ribs. No middle structure, no gaps for wind pressure to build. The curved steel shell and structural frame formed one integrated bearing system. When hurricane winds struck the Quonsets, they encountered solid metal. The T-rib frames remained rigid. Panels bolted directly to those ribs at 2-foot intervals had nowhere to separate. Wind force spread across the entire curved surface rather than gathering at vulnerable spots. Physics supported the continuous arch. The morning showed what had happened. 3 British Nissan huts destroyed. Personal belongings scattered for miles. British personnel exhausted, demoralized and furious at equipment that failed them in their moment of need. The American Quonsets had minimal damage. 3 panels bore slight dents where flying debris, probably pieces of the destroyed Nissan huts, had struck at extreme speed. One door had blown open when a sailor neglected to secure it. Rain entered the interior, but the structure remained solid. A British naval officer named Commander Hastings toured the American compound at 0700 hours, examining each Quonset carefully. He tapped on the corrugated walls. He inspected the T-rib connections. He observed the undamaged roof 300 yards away. His own personnel were recovering what remained of their quarters. Hastings found the American base commander, Captain Richard Walsh, in the operations bunker drinking coffee. "How much for 100 of those Quonsets?" Hastings asked directly. "You want to purchase them?" Walsh replied, surprised. "My men are sleeping in a concrete bunker designed for 12 people. We have 47 personnel. Calculate that yourself, Captain. Either we obtain American huts or we request transport back to England, because my people won't occupy another Nissan after last night." The cable to Admiral Moriel in Washington used formal military language, but the meaning was unmistakable. North Gale hurricane force, destroyed shipping harbor, stop. Crumpled PBY aircraft on beach like paper hats, stop. Ripped coverings completely from numerous British Nissan huts, stop. Quonset huts practically undamaged, stop. Request immediate additional units, stop. Otto read the telegram alone in his office at the Fuller Company warehouse. Outside, October rain fell on Rhode Island. Nothing resembled the 100-mile-per-hour gales that had destroyed 3 Nissan huts 600 miles northeast. His hands held the thin paper, rereading the words. Practically undamaged, crumpled PBY aircraft like paper hats. The Navy had wagered on an unproven design. Fuller Company had constructed a factory before validating the product. Jonas Petroskas had devised a bending mechanism in 6 hours. 10 sailors had assembled a test model in 1 day. Now, in the harshest storm Iceland had experienced in 5 years, the curved structure had survived while its British equivalent fell apart. Otto's hands remained steady this time. The seemingly impossible deadline had been accomplished. The design proved itself. The test succeeded. He permitted himself one quiet moment of satisfaction, sitting in the drafting room where he'd spent 72 hours in March, reworking the Nissan concept. Then he archived the telegram and continued working. The war approached. Everyone understood that now. And when it arrived, American troops would possess shelter that could endure hurricanes. 3 weeks later, December 7, 1941, war stopped being theoretical. December 8, 1941, Otto arrived at the Fuller Company office at 0600 hours, finding 3 urgent telegrams on his desk. The Navy Department, the Army Corps of Engineers, the British Purchasing Commission, all transmitted within hours of the Pearl Harbor strike. The messages shared identical urgency. More Quonsets immediately. As many units as manufacturing capacity allowed, the U.S. Army required 16,000 additional units for bases throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The Navy expanded its standing order for Pacific theater deployment. Britain sought 5,000 more under Lend-Lease to replace Nissen huts at bases stretching from Gibraltar to Singapore. Peter arrived 20 minutes afterward, still fastening his coat. "Did you see these orders?" "We cannot fulfill them," Otto stated plainly. The West Davisville factory was already pushing through 3 separate shifts, operating at absolute maximum capacity. That meant they'd hit a wall. They needed more production space, fast. Building a brand new factory from scratch took time, at least 6 months just to construct the facility and get all the equipment installed and running. 6 months they simply didn't have. Right now, MacArthur was in full retreat across the Philippines, and every day mattered. Wake Island was under siege. The construction battalions were mobilizing to construct forward airstrips all across the Pacific, but they couldn't deploy without shelter infrastructure waiting for them first. Otto stared at the stack of telegrams piling up on his desk, feeling that same crushing pressure he'd experienced back in March when Admiral Moriel had handed him that impossible 60-day challenge. Except this time, the situation wasn't theoretical anymore. This time, American soldiers were actually dying on beaches 8,000 miles away, and the infrastructure to support and protect them didn't exist yet. The West Davisville factory could produce roughly 400 Quonset huts monthly at current output levels. The incoming orders totaled 37,000 units. At the current production pace, fulfilling that demand would take 7 years. The war wouldn't last 7 years. To make matters worse, production was hitting bottlenecks everywhere. Anderson's sheet metal operation in Providence could only bend a limited number of corrugated panels daily, and their 3 custom machines ran around the clock. But Jonas Petrovskas's graduated pressure process, the innovative method he'd invented, simply consumed time. Physics couldn't be rushed. Over in Troy, Strand Steel Corporation was producing T-rib sections, yet the steel allocation boards kept prioritizing ships and tanks over shelter components. Every ton of steel becoming Quonset ribs was a ton unavailable for destroyer hulls. Lumber was disappearing fast, too, delaying crate construction. Each disassembled hut required 12 wooden boxes made from quality timber, and sawmills everywhere were drowning under demands for everything from rifle stocks to cargo pallets. Then the field reports started arriving from the first actual combat deployments. The news wasn't good. The continuous arch design, curving from floor to ridge and back down again, wasted precious interior space. Troops had to stack their bunks and equipment toward the center, where the arch was less severe, leaving the outer edges near the walls practically unusable. A soldier standing 6 feet tall couldn't straighten up beyond 4 feet from the center line without crouching. The original 16 by 36-foot dimensions proved far too cramped for field hospitals. There simply weren't enough beds, and medical personnel couldn't establish proper triage areas. Doctors were requesting larger versions, but scaling up meant recalculating all the load tolerances and completely redesigning the T-rib structure. From the South Pacific came a different problem: requests for wooden huts instead of steel. In tropical humidity, metal corroded rapidly and condensation formed constantly on the interior masonite walls. More troubling, steel conducted heat aggressively. A Quonset sitting in direct equatorial sunlight turned into an oven, with interior temperatures reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Otto worked through the complaints methodically, jotting notes in the margins of every report. Each problem demanded redesign, more testing, more precious time. America had almost none left. MacArthur was retreating toward Bataan. Japanese forces were sweeping across Southeast Asia. The construction battalions, Admiral Morial's newly created naval construction units, needed that shelter infrastructure now so they could start building the advanced airstrips that would eventually turn the Pacific War around. They didn't need it in 6 months. They didn't need it after testing, they needed it immediately. Otto set his pencil down and looked across the drafting table at Peter. "We have to start from scratch," he said. Peter sat quietly for a long moment. Outside, December rain pounded down on Rhode Island. Inside, the two men who'd spent 60 grueling days creating a shelter that had withstood Icelandic hurricanes now faced the harsh reality that their brilliant design simply wasn't sufficient. "The vertical walls," Peter said finally. "If we add 4-foot straight walls at the base before the curve begins, we recover that wasted floor space, and we switch from T-ribs to I-section ribs. Lighter construction, faster to manufacture, strand steel can produce them quicker." "Expand the footprint," Otto replied. 20 feet by 48 feet instead of 16 by 36. That gives us 960 square feet instead of 576. Otto was already sketching furiously. Over the next 6 weeks, the Quonset underwent complete transformation. Those 4-foot vertical sidewalls reclaimed usable space along the entire perimeter. The arch itself became segmental, 2 curved sections rather than 3, which reduced the number of different panel sizes needed and made assembly considerably simpler. Switching to the lighter I-section ribs cut shipping weight by 35% and manufacturing costs by 60%. They developed 86 different configurations. Barracks, field hospitals, chapels, bakeries, mess halls, radio stations, ammunition storage, repair shops, latrines, warehouses. Each variant used identical basic components, just arranged differently with various end walls and interior dividers. For the Pacific Theater, engineers at Seattle's Pacific Hut Incorporated developed all-wood versions using pressure-treated lumber that resisted tropical rot. For Arctic operations, the Jamesway Hut featured canvas stretched over a wooden frame with heavy insulation, far lighter to airlift than steel Quonsets. For ordnance storage where explosions posed risks, the heavy-gauge Army Hut provided blast protection. For massive warehouses and hangar-sized structures, they created the Elephant Hut. 40 feet wide, 100 feet long, creating 4,000 square feet beneath a single arch. The largest Quonset ever built during wartime. A warehouse on Guam actually used 42 elephant sections to create 54,000 square feet of covered storage. Strand Steel Corporation took over mass production in Detroit, converting automotive manufacturing facilities to churn out Quonsets. By mid-1943, they shipped 120,000 units annually. Total World War II production would ultimately reach 153,000 Quonsets of all varieties, yet numbers in production ledgers couldn't possibly convey what that design meant to the men living inside them. February 1942. A young construction battalion lieutenant named Robert Miller wrote a letter home to his wife in Ohio. He was stationed at a forward base in the Aleutian Islands, building an airstrip in conditions that made Iceland seem tropical. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. The wind never stopped blowing. Darkness lasted 20 hours daily during winter. "We received the new Quonsets yesterday," Miller wrote. "My crew assembled one in 6 hours, which the boys reckon is pretty impressive considering we were working through a blizzard with fingers too numb to feel properly. The veterans here remember the canvas tents from last month. They say 3 men died from exposure before these Quonsets arrived. Now we have a coal stove maintaining interior temperatures at 50 degrees even when it's -30 outside. The boys are calling it the Miracle Hut. Personally, I'm just calling it my ticket back home to you when this war finishes." Otto never saw that letter. He never learned Robert Miller's name. But by February 1942, countless letters like it were being written from advanced bases spanning 3 oceans and 2 hemispheres. Guadalcanal, North Africa, Iceland, Alaska, New Guinea. Wherever American forces deployed, Quonsets appeared within days, erected by construction battalions who could assemble shelter faster than enemies could destroy it. That 60-day deadline had become 153,000 shelters. The crazy curved design had become military standard. The impossible had become routine. Yet Otto felt no triumph. He felt drained. The conflict was expanding faster than production could manage. Every telegram brought fresh requests, additional modifications, new urgent timelines. The project, supposed to conclude in June 1941, had consumed his entire existence. There was still no end. August 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. A construction battalion landed 1 month after the 1st Marine Division had secured Henderson Field, launching America's first major Pacific offensive campaign. Japanese bombers attacked the airstrip daily, cratering the runways that had to be repaired before sunrise. At nightfall, enemy destroyers shelled the beach from offshore, their massive 14-inch guns transforming coconut groves into splintered devastation. Chief Petty Officer Mike Kowalski stood knee-deep in the surf, directing his 10-man crew as they unloaded Quonset crates from an LST landing ship. Mike was 43, a carpenter from Milwaukee who'd spent 25 years framing houses and crafting furniture before the Navy shipped him to Port Hueneme, California, for 6 weeks of combat construction training. Now he stood 8,000 miles from home, assembling shelters while mortar fire impacted 300 yards inland. The crates came off the LST on rollers, splashing into the surf, where sailors in hip boots grabbed them and dragged them toward shore. 12 crates per hut. 3 huts meant a field hospital, an ammunition depot, and a mess hall. 36 crates total, each weighing between 150 and 300 pounds. A Marine lieutenant watched from the tree line, smoking, his uniform still stained with coral dust from yesterday's patrol. "How long?" "Sunset," Mike answered without glancing up. "Hospital first, ammunition second, mess third. What if the Japanese hit us again?" "Then we work faster." The manual specified a 10-man crew could assemble a Quonset in 1 day under ideal conditions. But Guadalcanal offered nothing ideal. No concrete foundations, just wooden pallets laid on coral sand to keep the floor framework elevated above mud that appeared whenever rain fell. No proper tools either. Half the wrenches came from marine mechanics who needed them back by morning. No electric lights when darkness arrived at 6 o'clock. They'd either finish by moonlight or quit until daybreak. Mike's crew had assembled their first Quonset 3 weeks prior at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. That assembly took 9 hours under relatively safe circumstances. Now they labored on an active battlefield with enemy aircraft potentially arriving at any moment. The field hospital went up first, floor framework positioned on pallets, plywood panels snapped into place. I-section ribs bolted upright at 4-foot intervals, creating the skeleton. Then corrugated panels starting from the base of the 4-foot vertical walls and working upward to the segmental arch. Mike had learned the rhythm during training. Clamp, drill, bolt, move to the next panel. No wasted motion, no chit-chat, just methodical work. By 1 p.m., the hospital stood complete. A Navy corpsman appeared immediately carrying a stretcher case, a Marine with shrapnel wounds who'd been lying in a canvas tent since dawn. The corpsman carried him inside the fresh Quonset, placed him on a cot, and started an IV drip. The wounded Marine gazed around at the masonite walls, the solid plywood floor, the corrugated steel roof. "This beats my apartment in Brooklyn," he murmured, then drifted under morphine. The ammunition depot followed, this version with reinforced end walls and additional ventilation. By 4 p.m. it was finished, and Marine ordnance handlers were already stacking 300 caliber ammunition crates inside, moving explosives off the beach where Japanese artillery could target them. The mess hall started at 4:30 p.m. Mike's crew was exhausted, working in heat exceeding 95 degrees with humidity that made every breath feel suffocating. But leaving meant Marines would subsist on cold rations another day. And Mike understood from years of carpentry that keeping workers properly fed made everything else easier. At 5:45 p.m., as the sun descended toward the Pacific horizon and shadows stretched across Henderson Field, they bolted the final panel at the ridge. The third Quonset stood complete. A mortar round impacted 200 yards away, spraying coral and sand skyward. Mike didn't flinch. His crew didn't flinch. They'd worked under fire for 8 hours. You either adapted to it or you couldn't function. The Marine lieutenant strolled over, flicking away his cigarette. He studied the 3 Quonsets standing in a row, their curved steel shells appearing almost organic in the failing light, resembling enormous metal eggs buried in sand. "How long to dismantle them?" he asked. 4 hours, Mike said. "Load the crates back on an LST and move to the next island." The lieutenant shook his head slowly. "UCBs are crazy." "We build, we fight," Mike replied. That became the unofficial CB motto, coined by Admiral Moriel when he established the Naval Construction Battalions in March 1942. The concept was straightforward: construction workers who could defend themselves while building forward bases under fire. Carpenters and welders and heavy equipment operators who carried rifles alongside their tools. Over the following 3 years, CBs erected Quonsets on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Palau, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They constructed 111 major airstrips from raw jungle and coral. They built harbors, roads, bridges, fuel storage facilities, hospitals, and command centers. They housed 2 million soldiers in shelters that could be erected in hours and disassembled just as quickly when forces pushed forward. The Quonset became the physical embodiment of American mobile warfare, not tanks or ships or aircraft, but the unglamorous infrastructure making sustained operations possible. You couldn't hold an island without shelter for troops. You couldn't operate an airfield without maintenance facilities. You couldn't treat wounded personnel without field hospitals that wouldn't collapse in tropical storms. Otto's 60-day deadline had created the instrument that won the logistics war. But when the war concluded in August 1945, 170,000 surplus Quonsets faced an unexpected destiny. The military no longer needed them. Bases were shutting down, troops were coming home, mountains of curved steel shelters sat in storage facilities from Okinawa to Iceland, waiting for destruction orders. Instead of demolishing them, the government sold them to civilians at bargain prices. A complete Quonset hut, 960 square feet of weatherproof shelter, cost less than a used automobile. Veterans purchased them by the thousands, trucking the 12 crates to empty lots and assembling their own homes using the same instruction manuals they'd followed in the Pacific. Throughout America, Quonsets became churches, schools, businesses, workshops, storage barns, and family residences. In college towns, they sheltered returning soldiers using the GI Bill. In rural regions, they became equipment storage and livestock barns. In cities, they transformed into small factories and retail establishments. The military shelter designed as temporary became permanent. The wartime expedient evolved into peacetime architecture. The curved steel shells that endured hurricanes in Iceland and mortar fire in Guadalcanal now survived decades of American civilian service. June 1946. Otto Brandenberger stood in the same muddy lot at Quonset Point Naval Air Station where Admiral Moriel had handed him that envelope 5 years previously. The West Davisville factory sat silent now, production having ceased in December 1945. The war had ended. The contracts were finished. That impossible deadline had grown into 153,000 units that helped determine the outcome of humanity's greatest conflict. A young Marine approached across the lot. His name was Dale Red Hoffman. He was 24 years old now, lean and weathered, with a Purple Heart decoration on his chest. "Sir, are you Otto Brandenberger?" Otto nodded. Dale extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you. Your huts saved my life on Iwo Jima. A mortar hit 20 feet away, shrapnel everywhere. I was inside a Quonset dressing a wound. The steel walls stopped the fragments. The medic told me if I'd been in a tent, I'd be dead." Otto's throat tightened. He remembered Dale from that May 1941 assembly test, the Iowa farm boy who'd dropped a bolt and then found a spare. The young man who'd figured out the panel installation rhythm and taught it to everyone else. "You were the one who built hut number 1, Otto said quietly. Dale smiled. "I still drop things, but now I know someone always has a spare." They stood together, looking at the empty factory where 3 shifts of workers had once produced America's most remarkable military shelter. The building would be demolished within a year. The equipment would be sold for scrap. The drawings would go into Navy archives where they'd gather dust for decades. But across the Pacific, across Europe, across America, curved steel shells would endure for 50 years, 75 years, some still standing well into the 21st century. Churches in Alabama, machine shops in Oregon, storage buildings on farms in Iowa, each one descended from that impossible 60-day deadline. Crazy idea, Otto said almost under his breath. Dale looked at the older man, recalling what it felt like waking up on Iwo Jima inside a Quonset while mortars fell outside. Crazy good, he replied.